It's a huge factor for your own perception of reality, meeting a different being.
The whole planet deserves to know the truth. You may be one of the few people who might be able to help us understand.
Species are brought together on a table and have diplomatic conversations
This is
with each other.
happening?
This is happening.
Where? Give an example. What happened with you?
This great being enters the room. It's a strong, crisp frequency that your body reacts to.
It's happening. It's happening behind the scenes. I mean, Tim, what is the true history of Earth?
Have you ever imagined that you could project your mind to anywhere on Earth, to the depths of the ocean or underneath the Giza Plateau, to see what's next to the Great Pyramid? Or perhaps even out to space to see what's on the surface of some distant planet? Well, this has been called remote viewing, and our governments have experimented with this. Especially when we go look at Project Stargate with Dr. Hal Puthoff, Russell Targ, Uri Geller, Ingalls Swan, Pat Price, some of the best remote viewers of all time. So to find out about this, I thought we'd invite my friend Paul Elder on the show today. He's an instructor from the Monroe Institute, and he's been teaching remote viewing for some time. And so I want to delve deep into this subject. He'll also be joining us on the upcoming Initiation into the Mysteries of Egypt tour, and all the details are down below. It's in March 2023. You don't want to miss that. We have a great lineup, and he is going to be teaching remote viewing there, which is very exciting. But speaking of the Giza Plateau and pyramids, I thought we'd talk about these amazing Orgone pyramids. I can't say enough great things about them. You can have them in the house, the office, the bedroom, the garden. They have all sorts of different crystals and designs with different purposes, and they harmonize your entire place. I highly recommend them. Another product that I use and I love are these functional mushrooms. You can get them from neurobuddha.com. And this time of the year, which is the cold and flu season, I like to take chaga, lion's mane, and anything to give my overall health and immune a boost. And if you do go to the site neurobuddha.com, you can use the coupon code Enoch20 to save 20% at checkout. So, Paul, I want to jump into the questions here with you. Out of all these years you've been teaching people remote viewing, do you ever come across people who just aren't capable of doing it? Or do you have a high success rate?
Thank you, Johnny. Happy to join you. Yeah, I've been doing this for excuse me, got a little bit of a frog. Goodness, for probably 20 years, and I have not. I've trained over 3,900 people approximately.
Wow.
And I have seriously not run into a single person who just didn't get it. I mean, see, this is an innate human ability. This is something we all can do. It's built into us in our consciousness. And now, certainly, it's a lot like, or it can be a lot like musical ability. Everybody can learn to play the piano, let's say, you know. However, only a few get to go to Carnegie Hall. So some people are extremely talented at it, or can be, whereas other people are not as much. But I have not run into a single person who just didn't get it or didn't connect with something in our programs over the years.
That's really fascinating. Has there ever been anything that the students have uncovered for you when they were doing their remote viewings that really shocked you? Have you ever said, oh my God, that's just mind-blowing what they saw at a certain target?
I have run into that numerous times where, and it can be sometimes we use, because I do occasionally help out with, the intelligence services looking for missing people and so on and so forth. And so I've, many times I've had students who have blown my mind with some of the things that they've come up with that are verified correct. And over the years, there's been, a lot of them. And it just, I learn a lot from my students, if that makes any sense. Some people have certainly abilities in different directions. Now, I should clarify that when we talk about, the program is called remote viewing and so on and so forth. However, it's probably a misnomer. It probably should be called remote sensing, because in reality, that's more about what it is. If you're dealing with blind targets and things like that, it's about opening your mind, in different ways, to essentially, because we are human beings and everything that we process is through a sense of some sort, whether it's hearing, smell, taste, all of those things. All of those things are also heart-based. And what we found is that your left brain will make up stuff because it wants to be first, it wants to be the best, it wants you to be all of these things. However, your intuition or your heart never lies. So we teach people to rely here for the truth more than anything else, all right? So when we're talking about remote viewing or remote sensing in our classes and things like that, we would say, okay, now we have feedback for people, which seems very important. And it might, in the sort of in the learning practice stages, we might have a photograph of some person, place, or thing or event somewhere in history in an envelope. And we might put a random number on it so that the student can focus on that as a target number. So there's two things that you can do to begin with. I mean, you could try to mentally see inside the envelope, but then you're only trying to perceive a two-dimensional image. Wouldn't it be better if you could go in your mind to the location where the photograph was taken, at the time it was taken? And if you were there, what would you smell? What would you hear? What would you sense? What would you taste? It just enhances the whole thing. And so this is why I say it's probably important to note that it's probably more like remote sensing as opposed to remote viewing, because oftentimes in the early stages of learning, students really don't see in that sense, but they'll get all these other sensory impressions.
That makes perfect sense. And the reason when you're saying that I can relate to that is because when I used to practice clinical hypnotherapy, and when you look at how that works along with the neuro-linguistic programming, the NLP, when you talk to somebody and you're looking to give an induction for them, because when you go to a hypnosis appointment, even the interview at the beginning and when you're having basic conversation, it's already begun. And you're listening for what the person's saying, first of all. If they're the type of person when we look at like the syntax of our language and we see how someone is describing things, if a person is saying in the conversation, oh, I hear what you're saying, then you'd mark down the paper, this person is an auditorial person. If they're saying, well, I see what you're saying, Paul, or I can imagine that, well, then they're a visual. If they're saying, well, I feel that doesn't feel good to me, or that feels good to me, that's a K. And a lot of the times you'd have a combination of things. So if you were giving a person a suggestion, or you were bringing this into their induction to have something that works better for them to bring in hypnosis, you would use that sort of language based on the V, K, or A. And I think the reason for that, as you said, everybody's different. We all have a unique neurophysiology and biodiversity. So the brain is going to decode it differently. And with that, I want to ask you, we have this different idea traditionally that some people have their mixed views on, let's say, how alcohol affects what they call ESP, extrasensory perceptions, and all that sort of stuff. And it seems to me like some of the remote viewing people I've talked to, they said that they would try to distract the mind, get the mind to focus on one thing, so they'd shut off, all these different thoughts from coming in so they could go into another area. And alcohol, for example, it would change the prefrontal cortex of the brain, loosen up ambitions and all that sort of stuff. I would almost tend to think that it would help that someone is relaxed in certain situations when doing that. Can you remote view under any circumstance? Let's say you've imbibed in a glass of wine. Let's say that you're in a stressful environment. Let's say you have pressures, or do you have to be very calm to do it?
Well, probably it's probably necessary to be calm, but also say that one of the biggest things, or the most important things that we teach in remote viewing, is in calming the mind, letting go of all outside distractions. But here's something that's probably more important, and that's to occupy the left brain. Now, I wouldn't seriously recommend alcohol as I mean, it might be a relaxation kind of process. At the Monroe Institute, of course, we use a special sound frequencies that they call hemisync, that Bob Monroe came up with, or developed back in the 70s. And this was what attracted the CIA and intelligence services, who were at that point already were operating Project Stargate, and heard about Bob Monroe's product or his process of listening on stereo headphones to these frequencies that moved people very quickly to a state of their mind awake while their body is asleep, of deep relaxation. And they found that that was very, very helpful. And so they began to use that process with the sort of government remote viewers back in those days. And so they discovered that this was a very, a good way to relax the brain and to allow this process to happen, so that things could come into their mind through their different senses. One of the things that is probably the most important, as I mentioned, is occupying the left brain. And here's something that you can all relate to because we've all done it. If you occupy your left brain, it allows you to move into the right hemisphere of your mind, which is literally connected to the rest of the universe. And so little things, boring, repetitive things. The best example probably is driving your car. And you can be on a trip and you're going along for 3.5 hours or 2 hours, and you're driving and your left brain is occupied by the process of driving. But guess what? Your right hemisphere is connecting, and you're solving problems and you're finishing conversations and going through a whole bunch of things you're able to do that because your left brain is occupied with the driving part. And so this is very important, whether mowing the lawn, for instance, painting a wall, anything that's a boring, repetitive task, but especially driving, and people can, identify with that, right? And so anything like that in that process. So any of those activities, like my friend Joe McMonagle, one of the most prominent remote viewers for Stargate, and he would say he does a lot of his work when he's mowing the lawn because it's a boring, repetitive act. Now, if you're like me, I grew up on a farm in Saskatchewan, and from the time of 12 or 13 years old, I'm working the fields with a tractor. And so to put this into perspective, if you can imagine, you're pulling a 12-foot cultivator with an old farm tractor going at 1.25 to 2 miles per hour. How many rounds does it take to do an 80-acre field of absolute mind boredom? It allows you to spend a lot of time in the right hemisphere because the left brain is just driving along. So that's sort of the thing. If you can allow yourself or occupy the left brain is the most important thing, with a set intention underneath, which is to connect with whatever the targeting that you want.
Makes perfect sense to get the mental coordinator to start working like that, and to almost have like a mental fasting. I've heard of the process of finding a spot on the wall and letting the mind blank out. And there's been some neuroscientists I've heard talk about just exactly what you're saying, as well as I believe there was a book, I think it was called 2 Awesome Hours, where it said that, you want to do the maximum of productivity in a day, that certain folks and researchers were saying that you could get a peak of 2 really good hours, and the rest is a bonus. But they said in the process, if the mind starts dazing out and you find it necessary to look out your window of your office, and let's say you're just staring off into some leaves blowing around, or just like you say, just distract the mind, your brain and your mind is working out very complex matters. You might not realize it, but there's some kind of math problem or some kind of difficulty with work or whatever someone's trying to figure out. And when you snap out of that, you don't even realize it, but all of a sudden the answer is just, it's there, and you have this cognitive awareness of it. But going into these abilities that you teach people, and how to keep the left brain occupied and move into that other hemisphere and start tapping into these things, is there a way that you have found that this ability can be refined in such a way that, let's say, the CIA would have been interested in at the Monroe Institute looking at these abilities? Is there a way to sort of weaponize it? Can it only receive and sense things, or can it send things as well?
Well, no, that's a good question, and what you're referring to has been described as remote influencing. And so just going back in history, because this whole process started with the Soviet Union back in the early 70s. CIA had intelligence that the Soviets had specially trained people, psychics or whatever, who could literally sit in a darkened room in Moscow and describe missile sites in the US.
Do you remember that book, Psychic Discoveries Behind the Iron Curtain? Was that what it was called?
Something like that, yeah. But essentially using that process, and they had, and so that pushed American intelligence services to look for a way to counter that, and they ended up at the Stanford Research Institute in California with Russell Targ helped put together this program with, as you mentioned earlier, with Pat Price and Ingo Swann, to be able to respond or do the same thing, if you will. Well, the Russians apparently, or the Soviets apparently, thought, well, okay, if we can see somebody else's idea, can we install a thought into someone's mind? Can we influence somebody? And so over the years, I'm told that they spent a lot of time and effort and money on trying to do this, trying to do what they call remote influencing, and had very little to no luck with it. So it seems that we were able to, or people are able to sense someone else's mind or thoughts, whether that's telepathy or whatever it is. However, putting a thought into somebody else's mind, they had very little success, from what I understand.
Some have suggested, and I don't want to take our interview into some conspiracy idea that people's thoughts are being controlled out there, but some have suggested that there are types of psychotronic weapons and things that potentially could either vibrate the back of the skull, like Wired magazine has said, like the voice of God technology and all that. However, where I wanted to bring the next question to you was going back over to the Monroe Institute and looking at this fascination that would have been there by the CIA and other groups. I think it's really interesting, close proximity there with Virginia and everything. When we see this amazing movement that took place, I've always been a big Monroe fan because I'm a huge fan of the astral projection genre. And I always have been since a teenager. I'm sure you have been also, because, this is a huge fascination for you. And Monroe, he had the earlier techniques like the rollout technique, for astral projection. And over the years, I've been a big fan of Robert Bruce. He wrote Astrodynamics, which is one of my favorite works. I like the energy works books that he did with spinning the chakras all through the body to open up these meridians and pathways to aid in projections. And of course, William Buhlman, who I've had a chance to hang out with and talk to, We've been to conferences together. He was an instructor for astral projection over at the Monroe Institute, and recently he retired. But with looking at these techniques that we have for astral projection, how similar are they to remote viewing?
Well, it's probably a different process. I mean, there are some similarities to it, but it's really a different intent or a different process. Now, here's the things that that I've discovered, that sometimes, because the process of remote viewing, or remote sensing, I should say, literally applying your senses. And so, as I mentioned earlier, each of us has a different skill, if you wish, or a different way of processing. So somebody might be really good at, and if you're putting together, say, a team of remote viewers or remote sensors for a certain project or something, if you put together this team, it would be sort of like saying, well, gee, we want Joan on this team because she always gets, temperatures and feelings right. And we want Michael on here because he is so good with, action and in-depth things and stuff like that. So everybody, and even emotional aspects. And by the way, emotional aspects are some of the biggest portions of these targetings. So each person might have a different power, if you will, to apply to the group. And so putting it together in that kind of sense allows for, a lot more in-depth perception and so on and so forth. There is one thing that I want to say, though, and I mean, because I've known, all of these people that were in the Stargate project, and I should say that I've never worked for Stargate. I'm Canadian, but I've helped out with various things and various processes. So one of the things that people get a sense of is, I mean, because it was started out as a project for military intelligence, which is probably the biggest oxymoron in the world, and so it really had. So regardless of what sort of the generals or the Army or the Air Force or the Joint Chiefs of Staff or those folks, regardless of what they had in mind for the project, the people that were doing it, the Joe McMonagles, the Lynn Buchanans, and and Paul Smiths, all of these folks, and even Dale Graff, the former Pentagon director, you could not find more spiritual people on this planet. Because they had a job to do, but they understood it from a much broader level, that we are in this field of consciousness, all of us, and we really have connections to every other sentient being and all consciousness in the universe. And so, as I say, you could not find more spiritual people on the planet because they understand it from that broader aspect. And probably part of and what we found as well, and they found in the military program as well, intelligence program, that people that had near-death experiences seem to have a better aptitude or a more complete aptitude for this process of remote viewing or remote sensing. And so back in the early days, when they discovered that, they went around to they sent out the directive to the different military sources, whether it be Army, Air Force, all of them, and they said, hey, have you got any guys or gals who've been blown up or something, and now they're talking weird stuff? We want to talk to them, because they found that seemed to open the door. And so there's a lot of evidence of that. And for me, it seems to be very much a truth. I've had 5 near-death experiences. And I drowned when I was 12 years old and had this amazing experience. But when you're 12 and weird stuff happens, you go, well, that was weird. And you go on with life, right? And I didn't realize until much later how that had actually changed me. I was able to see things in my mind and develop over the years. And then, when I was 17, I was in a wild car accident, got smashed up really bad, lost a kidney and punctured lungs and everything else like that, and had another experience that was very powerful, and a connection with the spirit world and spirit guides, if you will. Now you have to understand, I'm a farm boy from Saskatchewan. I wouldn't have believed any of this if it hadn't happened to me. But didn't seem like a real kind of world. And then later on, when I was in in politics, it was the mayor of a city in Saskatchewan, and I had a heart attack in the middle of a hockey game, an old timers hockey game, and had a near-death experience, died in the ambulance on the way to the hospital, and had this powerful, powerful experience. And after that, I began to find myself, it really ratcheted open the door for me. And I would find myself floating at the ceiling of my bedroom going, holy crap, so it sort of loosened up my enclosed machinery, and I began to have spontaneous out-of-body experiences and things of that nature. And I found out about the Monroe Institute in Virginia and thought, I gotta go there. And anyway, that's what, in a rounded story. You mentioned that earlier about, certain people have different processes, and that was my leverage, if you will. That's what launched me into this, with several near-death experiences, and opened the doorway, if you will, to the psychic world. But there are a lot of people who have never had a near-death experience and do amazingly well. Now, here's I've been party to, or have access to, a lot of research, because we look at this prospect all the time, of who would be really good at this, what kind of people, what kind of backgrounds, would some would be really good at. So one of the things that I found, or many of them, that was really compelling was the fact that adults who had been abused when they were kids, whether it was physical or mental or sexual or whatever abuse, adults who had been abused as kids had terrific abilities in remote viewing and psychic abilities in remote sensing. And I've seen some of the reports on it where an adult would be talking to a psychiatrist, and the psychiatrist or the person would say, well, when it got really bad, I would go into the wall. They learned how to disassociate from their bodies. And in doing that, they took themselves out of their bodies, and in a sense, and now throughout their life, that has given them this extra sort of understanding or openness to the whole prospect of remote sensing, remote viewing. Does that make sense?
That's really fascinating. You should say that about the disassociation, because
Yes.
that's also what a lot of psychologists have said about people who claim to be wanting to pursue out-of-body experiences. It's a very secular position that they have, discounting the fact that we do have this consciousness that's a non-local awareness. But on the other hand, I can completely see how that would be the case. And it makes perfect sense, Paul. It really does. And I think that when we look at how they would want to recruit people for these aptitude tests, or even get someone like yourself to profile you and bring you in to be a part of these programs, it's interesting. They would have these identified markers. In the case of Project Stargate, for example, they'd want to find people who would be NDEers or had some kind of trauma to come in there. I had talked to one fellow that is in his 70s. He's a very good friend of mine, and he had gone through some sorts of interesting programs and training like that. And what he told me is, he said there was other types of training that they would do in those days. And one of the interesting things he told me is that they would take a book. I don't know if you've ever heard this. They take like a large book, flip it upside down, and get them to either mark the tops of the pages with a pen or flip through it really quickly and be able to read the entire book and speed record timing, be able to absorb massive amounts of information along with this remote viewing training. And there was other interesting things that folks that go through these kinds of training, it goes to show you that if we can remote sense something, as you would call it, that you hear about this kind of training that people in law enforcement have, that when they go to the scene of something, they know more than we're paying attention to. And the brain has a greater capability. If you bring the recall, that hey, there was a guy with a red sweater over there. This is what that license plate said on the blue Chevy, and there's this, and this. Whereas some of us, we might just remember getting out of our car and walking towards the door, what the temperature was that day. There's amazing ways to train the mind and to open up these things. I wanted to ask you, keeping this in mind, that there has been a recruitment program out there that you mentioned. We get this idea over the years, especially from movies out there, like, let's say, The Men Who Stare at Goats, talking about this sort of thing, which was brilliant, with Clooney and everyone, that this sort of training and these programs have dissipated, that they've disappeared, the funding has been pulled. But you yourself, you said that you do work for the intelligence agencies from time to time still. Would you say that these programs still exist? That are they just, not visible to the public?
No.
You can either confirm nor deny.
Ostensibly on the surface, I mean, back in 1995 or 1996 or whenever it was, when the story about this, about the U.S. government and military services using psychics, or especially trained psychics, remote viewers they call it, when that leaked out somehow, and you had like Chicago Tribune, New York Times with headlines like, "You won't believe what the government's been doing. They've been training psychics as spies," and so on and so forth. And when that got out, the CIA, or the intelligence services, came back and said, "Yeah, we've been messing with it, but it really doesn't work that good, so we're canceling it," right? And that's history, However, something that worked so amazingly well, you really think that they would cancel it?
Well, do you remember? Let me ask you this: do you remember? Of course, we were talking about Pat Price, who is some claim that he was one of the best, if not the best, remote viewer to ever do this, and he was a Burbank police officer, if I remember correctly. And he died under very strange circumstances. Some say maybe he was poisoned. He was found in a very strange position. And I've covered his story before on shows on Travel Channel. We were talking about this on the Alaska Triangle. We've talked about him on the Phenomena Files coming up. But that before he died, we know he was looking at these Russian kind of KGB related sort of targets. At the same time, some have said, well, is it because he was looking at Mount Hayes and weird alien kind of bases in Alaska, which was the angle that the Alaska Triangle was taking? But would you say that it can be dangerous to be a remote viewer in these programs? And number two, what do you think happened to Pat Price?
Pat was indeed, one of the best, right? I mean, Pat sort of changed the whole scope of it, along with Ingo Swann, when they developed the program.
Yes.
At Stanford Research Institute. And Pat did some amazing things. And that sort of harkened on one of the things that you mentioned earlier about, having a book and being able to. Here's the thing, a problem with, generally speaking, with psychic ability or remote viewing or even astral projection. Things like reading language and things like that, all right, are so difficult. a remote viewer or people in an out-of-body state cannot, generally speaking, cannot read, because reading and language and numbers especially as well are totally left brain concepts. And you're not in your left brain. You're in the right hemisphere of your mind, connected to everything else. So even things like, and I can't remember this lady's name. She was a doctor in Texas or in Florida or something like that, and was doing research into near-death experiences, and wanting to show in people, like in emergency rooms, when somebody dies and they have this amazing story and they say, I floated up to the ceiling and I could see this, and I actually had an experience like that, and I talked, and this doctor was saying, well, so what she did is she, as an experiment to test people if they really had this experience, she, on an upper level inside an emergency room, wherever she was operating with, had a statement, or like a sentence on, up on a wall, and that you'd have to be like 10 feet high in the room in order to see it. And people, they had some that had a near-death experience, as they would call it, who had floated up and were able to describe all of these things. And they said, okay, we put a message up there. What did you see? What did you read? And they were oblivious to it. I don't know. Because there again, language is left-brained entirely. And so they might cast doubt on this person's experience, even though the person might have said, I don't know, I couldn't make it out. It was like a blur or whatever. However, there is a red tennis shoe on the roof just outside this building, because I went up through the roof, and there's a red tennis shoe sitting on top of the roof close to the corner. And they would check that and go, oh my God, there was. So how would that person know that and yet not be able to read this? And why this was sort of important to me is, many, many years ago, when this was first happening to me, and I was so excited to be spending all of my time, or half of my time, trying to get out of body and to explore this. Now, I was the mayor of a city at that time, a fundamental Christian community in Saskatchewan. And so it was an odd mixture. I had to be very careful. I never told people about this, especially not around election time, right? And so one, as an example, I had heard that you cannot read something when you're out of body, because it's totally a left brain process that you're not in. And there's multiple levels of evidence to this. And so anyway, at this one particular night, I found myself going out of the roof of my house in an out-of-body state, and there was a thunderstorm brewing. This is in Swift Current, Saskatchewan, and I'm floating in the sky, watching a thunderstorm or a thundercloud ramping up. And it was so amazing because I could see the electricity in the cloud. I'd never visioned this before or saw this before. And it was just such a startling event, because I watched this storm cloud, and could see the electricity building up, and it was like a light inside this cloud that would come up like this around the corner in the cloud, and then it would go back down. And then it would come up again and build up in intensity, coming up around the cloud, and then go back down. And all of a sudden, this thing went up around and got really intense, and all of a sudden, boom, a big lightning bolt heads to the earth. And I'm watching this from, probably, a mile away or something like that. And something that amazed me happened, because here comes the lightning bolt coming down towards the earth, and all of a sudden, one came up from the earth, and they met together. It was like, boom. And I thought, wow, that was so cool. And then I thought, holy crap, maybe I shouldn't be out here in a lightning storm, right? And so I headed back through the window in the front of my living room, just floated through. And I'm floating in my living room thinking, okay, what am I going to do? And I noticed my wife had left a book open lying on the coffee table. And I remembered, because I'd heard that people can't read when they're out of body. And I thought, well, why not? And so I hovered over this, and I'm looking at this book lying open, and it made no sense at all. I'm looking at the top left page, which was finishing a sentence from the previous page. And it said something like, I said yesterday, right? And so I'm floating there, and I'm looking at this going, it was just a blur. It made no sense at all. And then I got the notion of ooh, I is everything. And it was just like frustrating. By the time I got to said or tried, it was just like, this was too confusing. So I thought, this is crazy. So I'm back in my body. I get up, I come downstairs, walk up to the book, and there it is. It says, I said yesterday. Why in hell couldn't I figure that out? Right? It was just such a stunning, but it was proof that it's super hard to actually get letters and numbers. Now they struggled with this, and there's some research that I have and things like that from back in the Stargate days where they were trying to get around this problem of not being able to read. All right. Wouldn't it be great if you could just go in your mind somewhere and read a top secret document or whatever it was? And they found it was just like really, really difficult. And they were trying to figure out ways to get around this problem of processing. Numbers especially are difficult for people that are in out-of-body states or even psychics. You ever wonder why? How come you don't ever read the headline "Psychic Wins Lottery"?
So it's
Right?
hard to get the numbers and break them down with the left side of the brain, as you say. Now,
Totally.
this brings up another interesting subject, because since the brain, our coordinator, as well as I think this is ingrained in our DNA, perhaps, that we have this focus on the here and the now. And I think this mental coordinator that's kind of siphoning out our experiences as well as our eyes, that when we look through our the rods and cones in our eyes and things as they come up the optic nerve and they're processed through the visual cortices at certain spectrums. And as you know, we're only seeing so much in the human light spectrum before we start going into the ultraviolet, and we talk about infrared and all these sort of things. There's no doubt that this filter kind of keeps us sane, because if we didn't have that, we literally live in a reality with quantum multiplicity, where the future is happening at the same time as the now, and the past is happening. All these things are happening at the same time. And we can only imagine that if you can remote sense or remote view something without any sort of spatial limitations, that we have this ability to go anywhere outside of that time-space sort of configuration. Is it possible then, in your opinion, to accurately view the past or the future, and not just in the current, present, now of the reality? And if so, I have to ask you, Paul, have you remote viewed our future? Have you remote viewed 2024 and 25?
Yes, it is possible. And you're right. It's like reality is fluid. All right. So, it is the past. I mean, we can easily remote view the past and come up with things that people didn't know about the past, that, and also remote view the future. And folks like, like Ingo Swann and Joe McMoneagle, for instance, did some remote viewing, and it was about, about the future or whatever, about a planet, I think, and that they were going to encounter in the future, and described it perfectly. And back in, like 1978 or 80 or whatever it was, they discounted it and said, no, that's silly, And then the Explorer or the satellite, that the next, 20 years, 30 years later, is out going through the universe, and they go, holy smoke, he was right, So it seems like there is a fluid base in which time really is sort of is fluid, So I have actually, and this is one of the things that I've developed, is looking at the future. And how do you look at the future? So, we certainly have done remote viewing in the past. Anytime if you're trying to say, find a murder suspect or a criminal or a missing person. I mean, you can go back into the past and you can take a look and you can see or I should say, sense all of the folks involved in it. All right. Now, after people practice, I mean, like the remote viewing part, actually seeing something, may not happen in the early stages. After you develop this and become more and more practiced, more and more practiced, you learn by mistakes. You learn what not to, to allow to take you off in the wrong direction or whatever. But remote viewing the future can be a bit of a different process, but it really is actually also quite simple. And I have been tasked with predicting future events. Sometimes, for instance, what would be a good example? Let's say the Russian Olympics in Sochi. This is a number of years ago, right? And so there was a lot of concern about because there were a couple of, just before the Sochi Olympics or the Russian Olympics, there was a couple of Black Widow bombers or whatever who had blown themselves up or blown, and so there was a big concern about Western Olympic teams. Could they be targeted? Would they be targeted? That kind of thing. And so what I did internally was, it's like to tell myself to look at the future. How am I going to do that? Well, actually, we can predict the future by looking at the past, which doesn't make any sense, right?
It does, yeah.
So what I envisioned,
cause and effect,
right?
Or
So
stasis.
How I did this and what I envisioned, and other people have done this as well, is projecting myself ahead, say 2 years from the present date. And this is what I also teach as well. So now, for instance, I might say, okay, this is now, December of 2022. What's going to happen? Like you asked, what's going to happen in 2024? Is there anything to look out to? By the time we reach 2024. So how I would do that in my sort of universe is I would put myself into this state and I would imagine that it is now 2024. But I would look back and say, okay, over the past 2 years, since 2022, what has stood out in my mind? What have I seen on television? What have I seen as the major news events of the last 2 years? And then the information might come on and go, oh my God, there was a complete revelation that all of this is crap, and that there's some medical people and doctors who are going to go to jail for just.
Can you do me a favor, Paul, sometime? I mean, I think it'd be fascinating to do a show with you of picking 5 major targets, let's say ancient Egypt, Mars, something, and say, well, what did you ever sense there? And I know you're a busy guy, so it might be hard for you to take the time to look at those targets. But if you ever get a chance, I tend to think something big is coming by 2025. And I think that it could be geological. We could have some changes around the world in certain places. But I've kind of had the heads up and different sources that are pointing me in that area. And I don't know what direction the Earth will take. I hope that we all will be okay. Of course, we will. We have a future. We have a destiny. But I'd be certainly interested to hear from you sometime what you see on those future timelines. At the same time, I think it's really fascinating what you do, and I know you've helped a lot of people. I've heard so many countless stories about you, of people that said that your remote viewing, you've helped locate people. You've helped, as you mentioned, with intelligence agencies, law enforcement. I think it's really incredible, the stuff that you guys have done. And you're a great teacher, and you do have a wonderful book out that folks can get. And I want to have the links to all of that below. Do you have anything you want to leave the folks at home with today? Do you have a message for those out there that want to learn about remote viewing or sensing?
Well, I'm in so many ways. I mean, I'm getting older and older. And by the way, don't ever get old. It sucks. All right. I've there's a part of me that is still 12 years old. That, I mean, notwithstanding the insanity in the world right now, this is a super cool time to be alive. There are so many things happening, and like you were talking about, and over this next 2-3 years, we are going to see a major shift, and this is what you were talking about, and so many people sense this is coming along. All right, this is a really cool time to be alive, and one of the things that we're going to see, I predict, over the next several years is the full disclosure, the landing on the lawn. All right, and we're seeing excuse me, we're seeing tips of that now. You know, we have NASA, we have the military intelligence releasing little blurbs about UFOs, about extraterrestrials, and so on and so forth. And there's more and more of this coming. Whereas for a long time it was like, nope, nobody talked about it, nobody does anything about it.
Are
right?
you
And
saying, Paul, are you saying right now that you have remote viewed this and you see that a disclosure is coming officially, that we're going to see it in front of us?
Yes.
Wow.
Over the next few years, and like I say, you're seeing evidence of this now. All right. Um, you know, as the various governments are releasing more and more information on extraterrestrials and so on and so forth, we are going to see the landing on the lawn kind of thing, if you will, over the next few years. And there's some important things that are surrounding this. And that's why I say this is, you know, I mean, this is like Paul Hellyer, you know, Canadian defense minister for so many years, and what he predicted as well, saying, you know, we don't have to go out and see if ET is here. They've been here for thousands of years. And like Paul said, is where do you think we got all the technology that we have now? If you think back in just the last 25 years, it's been an explosion. Our whole world changed 25 years ago, and it has ramped up at such a huge speed. And so we have amazing people like Elon Musk and so on and so forth. So what happened since 1972 or whenever it was that changed things about going to the moon?
Well, yeah, well, Colonel Philip Corso from the day after Roswell, he was talking about that, you know, all the stuff we get leaked out to Silicon Valley. You had not only transistors, LEDs, you had nitinol, memory metal, nickel and titanium, all that stuff he claims came from up there, and Velcro even. So it's really fascinating what you're saying and this progress that we're making. But I think it's really incredible that you could sit there in that chair right now where you are, and you could project your mind to wherever it needs to be, to the past, to the future. It just shows you how incredible we are, and we can make all these entanglements. I think it's truly fascinating. And I want to thank you so much, Paul, for being here with us today. And I'd like to know, can we have you back again to do some more shows?
Whenever you like.
I love that.
I'm close to retiring, so you know, I'm looking forward to it, you know, and I'm tiring.
No, I know, but you know, we're going to have to get you in for a lot more shows until you retire. And I'll tell you that there's so many subjects that we could explore that I'd really love to talk to you about. And of course, I am looking forward to coming on that tour with you coming up, the initiation into the Mysteries of Egypt tour. And again, everyone will have the info in the description below, so we can all go on that tour together. And I think it's going to be amazing. The idea, Paul, is that people could come out and they could take a course with you over there, which is always great, or they could travel with you into Egypt, touching the sides of a temple wall and downloading the ancient past and taking that trip back like a time machine. It sure beats opening up some history book that's filled with half-truths. I want to thank you again so much for being here with us today. Everyone, go check out Paul Elder, buy his books, take the workshops, Go out there and listen to what he has to say. He has shares so much amazing information just like this. And remember to like, subscribe, comment down below, and share this video with your friends. And we'll talk to you all on the next episode.